Europe.
Well, tell me about your own past. You were born in New York. Were your parents particularly musical?
My parents weren't particularly musical, but I do remember that my grandfather on my father's side, he used to play the violin. He was from the Satu Mare region of Hungary, which used to be quite a very religious area, home to the Satmar Hasidim. But the family at some point had broken with religion, but the melodies remained the same. On my mother's side, I think it was most interesting the old 78s that her grandparents used to listen to in Yiddish. That became part of the treasure trove that I would listen to find out, where does this Yiddish music come from? What does it mean? What does this culture come from?
Spiel mir Liederle in Jiddisch, der Wecken soll es Fred und nicht Achidisch. Als alle groß und klein so kennen du's verstehen, von Mol zu Mol du's Liederle soll gehen. A Liederle und 17 und Regen.
And so I think there were these strands from my father's and mother's side, and to combine that with my father's native language of Yiddish meant that I had the whole feeling that this culture is somehow present, somehow absent, and I think that particularly in Germany I was able to put the pieces together.
Were your parents particularly religious?
No, not really, but there were aspects of the family where religious is not necessarily something a person can write on their tombstone. A person is a dynamic thing. A person is sometimes more devotional, sometimes less, sometimes not at all, sometimes completely. So I think it's a moving target, and I think that sometimes you just have to realize that a person has the gene or they don't.
Well, you seem to have had the gene because you went off to Israel to study in a yeshiva.
Well, actually, it didn't start out that way. I mean, it was 1982. I had just finished my bachelor's degree in music. The first Lebanon War had just broken out, and I had thought that this would be a good time for me to do my part in helping Israel. I went to Israel, that was the fall of 82, to be a volunteer on a kibbutz. That would free a space for a soldier to go to war. And over that time on the kibbutz, I wound up performing with the Jerusalem Symphony Orchestra. And my first elbow runnings with klezmer music, starting to find out what this thing is. And with my time then in the yeshiva, I could ask questions what traditional Judaism means, traditional Jewish culture, and to actually see it in a living context. That wasn't always that easy in America. In the 60s and the 70s, some people, they would do anything but live a traditional Jewish life.
How did your parents regard your choice? It would have been quite radical for them.
Well, I think it's radical for a lot of people, but people do understand it. Nobody's that far away that they have no understanding whatsoever. Something like keeping kosher or the Shabbat laws are somehow in our collective memory. They're not something that seemed totally aberrational. And I think that sometimes when a person simply says, instead of not working Sunday, I'm not going to work Saturday, it isn't really something extraterrestrial anymore.
Well, it's much easier also in Israel, as you say. But why didn't you stick to the orchestra circuit?
Well, there was this evening when I was playing with the orchestra, the Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, And because I'm a percussionist or trained in everything you smash, bash, or crash, I realized that there was absolutely nothing to do for the first three movements, sitting there for 45 minutes waiting for the final movement, and then as the final movement comes, I stand for my triangle strike. Ding! I think that was the moment that I decided I really wanted to be a soloist. So I wind up becoming a soloist on the love of my life, the marimba, also known as a xylophone.
Yes. Well, in a previous conversation, you said to me, I don't play the music. I am the music.
Well, that doesn't come in the beginning. That comes with a certain amount of artistry. A person has to have internalized the music, not just memorized it, but you have to have it inside your bones so that you, particularly in my instrument, when you play it, it becomes a preordained choreography, a kind of a loss of conscientiousness about everything you're doing, and just everything flows. It's not about only the melody flowing, it's about how the right flows to the left, how your weight moves. It's a totally seamless performance. And that means not thinking about how it looks. It's a complete loss of thinking about what you're doing or how it could appear. And when people see how you become one with your instrument, one with the music, then it's not a person playing Jewish music. You're simply bringing that dynamic into the here and now, into a visual format where you become a visual aspect of the music.
That sounds almost analogous to real prayer, to be lost in the prayer, to be lost in the divine embrace.
Well, for many years, I've actually drawn that very conclusion. Prayer is the language that I use with God, and music is the language that I use with my fellow human.
I know you're inspired by the Jewish philosopher Bahya ibn Pakuda, who wrote Duties of the Heart. He spoke of humility, repentance, the ascetic life, and the love of God. Do you see your life playing music on the streets through that lens?
Well, I think that I like to see things through a lot of lenses. When I look at things like how during the Hasidic times, early Hasidism, how Jews, particularly poor Jews, who were musicians, who would tell stories, they would move around from village to village, and the villages who couldn't afford to have a rabbi were happy to have these itinerant minstrels then show up on Shabbat in return for receiving food, a place to stay for Shabbat. They would share their melodies, and they would share the stories. And these were not just stories that you would tell, but rather life-changing stories. They were allegories, things built on generations of experience, melodies that would change a person's life because of the incredible power inside the melody that a person could achieve when they sang them. And at the end of Shabbat, then a person would move on to the next village. These kinds of traditions, of course, they formed my way of looking at what I do. We don't have those kinds of living conditions anymore, but we do have the idea of sharing something that's just so essential that people don't even remember to ask for these kinds of things. Sometimes something hits you just because you just weren't prepared for it. When somebody tells you a story in such a way, and it's not just that it's funny or that it's witty, there are sometimes stories that really change your life because they have such an incredible power to them. And I think that these stories can also be told in a musical way. And for me, it's an important thing to do that. Have sometimes as much power as possible in the simplest way that you can, much in the same way that a Japanese artist who can tell an entire story with a single line, or in haiku, with so few syllables to try to represent an entire state of mind. I think that brevity, that strength, is something very beautiful that we also try to do in Judaism, not to waste time and energy.
Well, you've become something of a phenomenon in Germany. You're well known. You told me you're a little bit famous, and I had a feeling that, in fact, you were a lot famous, that you're on radio, you're on TV, you're on the streets, you're in conservatoriums giving master classes. So how do you...
Don't believe everything you see in the press.
Well, how do you stay focused on the Creator? How do you remain essentially at one with the demands of humility and asceticism?
Well, I'm not always as humble as I would like to be myself. I mean, I think that it's an important thing to remember that if you are given a certain talent, whatever that is, and if you're given a certain audience, you've been lent the public ear, then you have an awesome responsibility to return the public ear to its status quo ante. You can do something good for people, but you have to realize you have to be very gentle and very careful with the time that you have when you're doing something for other people. And you should never, ever use it for your own aggrandissement. And I think that this is something that I've learned. Be gentle with other people. Take what you have and share it. It's most important, in my opinion, not to set yourself up on a stage as if you were one of the prophets. God does that in his own way with the prophets. And if artistry is the 21st century form of prophecy, then stay on the ground with the peons, because that's where the message is to be remaining. And I'm not trying to make anything bigger than it's supposed to be, but sometimes the biggest message is found in a very small word.
Well, where will you be on the High Holy Days in September?
I believe this Rosh Hashanah I will wind up in the Joachimsthaler Straße Synagogue in Berlin. It's one of my favorite places. It's one of those buildings that survived Kristallnacht 1938, where the power of the newly reconstructed Russian, Jewish, German community in Berlin as a place where all these hyphenated identities come together, where people remember where they were from and they're looking where they're going. And when you have a new year start there, it's a new creation. It's not just a rehashing of old identities. It's an ability to bring old identities new into the future. And I think that's something that brings me energy as well.
It must be extremely sorrowful and poignant, though, to be there in Germany or perhaps in Poland, where I understand you also will be shortly.
Yeah, I'll be in Poland this weekend to do a concert in the White Stork Synagogue. That was the major synagogue for the city of Breslau before it was destroyed. And sure, I mean, I think that it's impossible to really get past all that misery and all that suffering without wanting to turn it into something positive. It's not enough to simply cluck your tongue and say, oh, how terrible and the tragedy, and to drive past Auschwitz and say, okay, I've seen it. Now it's clicked off my list. Now I don't have to do anything else. A person needs to take all that tragedy and to transform it into something good. And if I think that I can take the voices of some of these murdered Jews, if I can take the music that's been salvaged, and if I can turn it into sound, music that's live and warm and brings beauty into people's hearts, if I can bring that to the airwaves, then maybe the Jews aren't really completely dead. Maybe we can still bring them back. Maybe we can, maybe not their voices, but maybe the echoes of their voices can be reinvigorated. Maybe we can do something to add good to the universe from what bad happened. And I think that that's an important thing. That's a very special resonance to be found.